We turn now to the Old Testament wisdom literature. These books are not history, they're not prophecy, but they are setting out guidance as to the way to live, or at least facing up to some of the issues of living in this world. The main books of wisdom are Job and Proverbs, although the book of Psalms is heavily influenced in places by the wisdom tradition, and will leave it in its usual position between Job and Proverbs. First then, to Job. We're going to take three samples: Woe is me, There must be more, and The Lord speaks. First of all then, Woe is me. We shall be looking in chapter 3 of Job, but we've got some things to think about first. The book of Job consists of 2 chapters of a prose story, followed by a massive poem. The prose story is unremarkable, but the poem deserves to be ranked alongside the great works of literature of the ancient world. You might like to think of it the way that I do, that the prose story at the beginning is a write-up of a folk story or legend, which itself is playing a what-if game. What if this very virtuous man in our history was really properly virtuous, and yet suffered? Would he remain as virtuous? Would he remain as faithful to the Lord? The poem is then a working up of that ancient story, putting it into a level of detail and argument that were never part of the standard version of the old story. Now, I can't prove to you that that's the right way to think of it, but it works for me, and I commend it to you as a sort of working idea as to how to reckon with the different bits that are in this book. Well, we'd better start by at least skimming over the details of the old story. It goes something like this. There was once this man called Job, who was unbelievably virtuous and pious, and filthy rich with it, and he ranked in heaven as the Lord's favourite. Enough to make you sick, thought the devil. So the accuser, which is probably better to call the devil at this stage of history, the accuser starts arguing with the Lord. Look, would your favourite still be as virtuous and as pious if he lost his wealth and suffered some horribly painful disease? Well, the outcome of that was that the accuser won the right to withdraw all of the trappings of Job's comfortable life and afflict him with bodily sores all over. Yuck. So to the poem. It begins with Job very naturally bemoaning his lot. If you'd like to read the first 10 verses of Job chapter 3. There's no point in claiming that really godly people react to suffering by heroically soldiering through it from day one. Anyone, when faced with a sudden onset of suffering, will begin by thinking that the bottom has fallen out of their world, and they will concentrate for a while on registering the pain they're undergoing. I would say that if they don't do that, then they haven't got a problem, and they haven't got a problem over which, by God's grace, they need to gain the victory. If they're so thick or so insensitive that their suffering is no problem to them, it's not suffering, so it doesn't count as a part of what we're looking at. Job's suffering is pictured in the story in the most extreme terms, so his initial reaction to it is also very strongly drawn. He curses the day he was born and fantasizes about turning the clock of history back so that the day of his birth could be eliminated. That is, the pain of being as he is makes him jump to the conclusion that he would have been better off never having been born in the first place. Now, I don't feel we can complain about Job expressing himself in this way in view of what he was going through. But only a slight shift sideways takes me into the troubled area of abortions, where people actually do make sure that the day of someone's birth doesn't happen. Our 2 eldest daughters are both adopted because their birth families, for one reason or another, couldn't cope with them. and it troubles me to think that had their born mothers taken a different line and had an abortion, those two fabulous young women would never have come to birth. I find that really painful as a thought. Issues like whether an unborn child survives until birth, I think really ought to be left to the Lord. They're far too heavy for the likes of us to handle. Let's read the next section from verse 11 to 17. Job has some sort of a notion of an afterlife. Historical research suggests that it was probably more akin to the idea the Greeks had about Hades than it is to our idea of heaven, a place for the undead rather than a paradise. But even so, he regards it as a place where one's suffering is over, where the great and good are on equal terms with those whose lives have been a mess or who have been oppressed, even when they've been oppressed by the very rich and powerful that they're currently alongside. Had Job been a stillbirth or had been smothered at birth by being buried alive, he would now be in that afterlife alongside kings and princes and released from the burdens he now bears. That he finds an attractive thought. But there's something else going on in this section. Job is asking why. This is not just a rhetorical device, simply giving another format to his moaning. It's the beginning of what dominates the whole poem, namely his searching for some meaning in what's happening to him. I think it's a common human reaction to hardship or suffering that you can take on the business of coping with it, provided you can see some sort of sense in what's going on. But if you have no grasp at all of how it makes sense, you're left with an abyss of emptiness inside you, and you don't have any means by which you can lay hold of your life and cope with it. That's what a lot of people experience at any rate. So Job asking why is not simply an intellectual questioning, sort of, here's a nice one, let the rabbis debate this one. It's not that. It is rather a desperate attempt to survive in the face of his suffering. Yes, the answer he wants will come in the form of arguments and explanations. Yes, it will have an intellectual form. But its impact on Job will be in terms of enabling him to survive, and one hopes enabling him to turn aside from the desperation that he's voiced in the opening of the poem. So, why? Now if you'd like to read verses 20 to 26. Yes, there are people whose lives are so wretched that they long for the day of their death. It's a real mystery of human life why such people are granted a continuing life when all they long for is death. And it reminds you that today, as European humanism more and more dominates our society with its all-powerful notion of human rights, it reminds you that there are increasingly many people who think that those who are in this state of desperation have the human rights to bring about their own death. Hence those Swiss clinics that people go to be killed humanely. I think we have to say that we are there at a point like with abortion, where we're a lot safer to leave the decisions involved to the Lord and not ourselves try to play God. Yes, it's a messy situation for sadly many people, but we ought to let God be God and not try doing his job for him. Verse 23. What Job voices here is an extreme form of what we all face, that the basic means of our grasping life are hidden. We can only grasp them through faith because our human senses don't allow us to see directly the material we need in order to make sense of life. That must be more frustrating for someone in Job's desperate position. And verse 26. This verse proves that this isn't just an intellectual quest for answers. What Job wants is peace, not so much increased knowledge. He wants, yes, knowledge of what is currently hidden from him. That will help, but only insofar as it produces peace within him. So he asks, why? He screams, why? And the rest of the poem concerns his search for a meaningful answer to that question. But that is the end of our first sample, so that's where we leave it for the moment. Our second sample takes us to chapter 19 of Job, but before we read this chapter, we must say something about how Job pursued the answer to his question. He was visited by 3 friends, all of whom appear to have been brought up in safe, conventional homes well inside the confines of respectable, organised religion. And from within that safety, they dish out to Job the conventional answers which obviously seem to have worked for them within the safety of their own lives. The sorts of lines they took were things like this. If you're suffering, then it must be that you've done something wrong somewhere along the line, so that your present condition is the Lord's just punishment for what you've done. Or, if there's something wrong in your life, all you have to do is genuinely to turn to the Lord and he'll deal with it and see that you're okay. Now, these approaches might work for a lot of people a lot of the time, but they didn't work for Job. The trouble with the "you must have sinned" approach is that the whole point of this working over of the old story is that Job is supposed to have led a perfect life. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that makes the story a hypothesis, a what-if exploration, because the only actual perfect life I know about is Jesus. But within that exploration, this line clearly didn't make sense, because the whole point of the poem is that Job was supposed to be without sin, so looking for sin in his life was, by definition, fruitless. Within the terms, then, of the old story, Job's suffering arose from Satan's annoyance at his perfection, not from Job's sin. So the friends taking this sort of line were seriously missing the point. And Job, too, on the receiving end of this sort of argument, couldn't relate to it at all, and he said so with some expressions of frustration. The other line, that you really ought to turn to the Lord, also missed the point. The whole force of the poem is that Job is spending his entire time turning to the Lord for the answer to his questioning. Presumably his conventional friends have some sort of religious formula in mind when they tell him he should turn to the Lord, but Job has already ventured well beyond mere formulae. He's totally laid his life before the Lord, pleading with the Lord to tell him how it all makes sense. So this line is missing the point as well, and again it made Job rather frustrated having to listen to such shallow nonsense. These 3 friends are often referred to as Job's comforters, which is what they intended to be. But they brought him, in fact, no comfort at all. If anything, they were using conventional religion to get in the way of Job's heartfelt approach to the Lord. I think it's time to turn to the text. Would you read, please, the beginning of chapter 19, the first 6 verses? I think you can hear Job's frustration in these verses, having to put up with his friends' offerings, and he responds in argument. Firstly, that if he has done something wrong, their do-gooding intervention is only getting in the way because it's a matter that he has to sort out with the Lord. And then the triviality of their contributions annoys him, as they dare to put themselves on a higher plane than he is, from which they can venture to instruct him as to what he should do. You know that if a counsellor is going to do you any good, you don't want them instructing you from way above where you are. You need them to come alongside you, to enter into a situation with you and take you seriously. And until they do that, there's little hope that you'll be able to listen to what they say. Very rarely will you come across someone you feel free to allow to play the guru to you and direct you as from on high. Will you read the next few verses, please, 7 to 12 in chapter 19? He says, I've been crying out to the Lord, pleading with him to let me know what all this mess is about, and all he's done is stonewall me. I don't know whether he's hearing me and deciding not to answer, or whether I'm simply not getting through to him in the first place. Either way, my calling on the Lord is getting me nowhere, and it's driving me round the bend. And then please 2 verses 13 to 20. Something which makes the isolation he feels from God seem all the worse is that he's been genuinely isolated from his family and friends. I suppose that the more shallow of his friends and acquaintances will have steered clear of him as someone whose life has gone to pot, and they wouldn't want to risk it rubbing off on them. But even his genuine friends have found his condition so distressing that they've been keeping out of his way, and his family have done much the same. He's been left entirely on his own to cope with his experiencing that the Lord is turning his back on him too. Help. Verses 21 and 22, if you'd look at, please. Even worse, the 3 supposed friends who have actually spent some time with him seem more against him than for him. According to their conventional religion, what they have done and said may be correct enough, but it's lacked any sense of pity. They've in fact remained as far away from any sort of fellowship with him as have the rest of his friends. From the enormous distance of sitting next to him, but not allowing themselves to go anywhere near him, they've been adding their refusal to take him seriously to the way that God himself has appeared to have been treating him. Now please verses 23 to 29. Job is now reaching the point of firmly rejecting the line that his friends are taking and searching within himself for what it is that he can be sure of. This might remind you of the search of René Descartes for the point at which he could be so certain of things that he could begin reconstructing his philosophy of life from there. And the point he reached was when he realized that he was thinking, and that meant that he was there. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Job, at this point of the story, is searching for his own cogito. What is it that I can be most certain of, and I can build on from there? Verses 25 to 27. These verses have a celebrated place in Handel's Messiah. What Handel or his librettist does there is to take these words pretty much as they are in the authorized version and assume that they mean what they would mean if they were in the New Testament or if they were addressed to us today. In fact, there are 2 problems with doing that. One is that verse 25 in particular is notoriously difficult to translate, and what it has in the AV is something of a shot in the dark as to what it might possibly mean. And because it's so difficult, lots of modern translations have simply rephrased what they've got in the AV. There isn't any clear idea of what the Hebrew actually means. And the other problem is that we've already had cause to remark that Job's view of an afterlife is some centuries behind what we find in the New Testament. So we shouldn't assume that he's just talking about a New Testament sort of view of resurrection. Nevertheless, he is clearly saying that he is confident that in the end he will be able to meet with God, and that the Lord will then vindicate him. In his heart, he knows that his suffering is not his fault, and he believes that the Lord knows that too, so that when he meets up with the Lord, it will be a reassuring experience for him in which the issue will be settled once and for all. And back to verse 23. Just in case there's any doubt about the case that he's been making out for himself, he wishes it could all be written down and preserved for future generations, and then they could eavesdrop on this argument and have a chance to realize that Job has been playing with a straight bat. This verse, of course, is the writer of the poem having a little giggle with us, because he did write it down, and he was writing it down at the very moment at which he wrote this verse. Verses 28 and 29. Now Job's confidence has strengthened and reached the point in which he can round on his friends quite boldly. He tells them that they've been so wide of the mark that it must be that they're at some distance from the Lord themselves, and that when they come to stand before God, they should fear the experience, because it will be revealed to them how they've been impeding the Lord's work over the years. So, Job has allowed his three friends to try to input into his life. Perhaps that's helped in a way, because he's no longer spending all his time wishing he'd never been born. He's too busy arguing with them. But he's had to reject what they've said as being hopelessly conventional and shallow and not taking him seriously. But now he's managed to work through that experience to a point of being confident of how things will turn out in the end. That's great. But his basic question has still not been answered. Why? That concludes our second sample in the book of Job. Our third sample takes us to chapter 38, but think of this first. I don't know whether you've read anything of Job before, but let's pretend you haven't. So Job has reached a point of some confidence about his destiny, but still hasn't got anywhere near finding an answer to his questioning, or getting the impression that the Lord is paying him any attention. So I'm going to assume that you are desperate to know how it all turns out. But two things happen before the end of the book. The first is that another friend turns up, and it looks as if this part of the poem was written by a later poet who thought he had something to add and the literary ability to add it. And I think he was wrong on both counts, so we'll just ignore that bit. The second is that the Lord does turn up and talk with Job, or more accurately, talks at him, and gives him a right talking to. The Lord ignores the three friends, and mercifully the fourth as well, and deals directly with Job and his questioning. There's first a long speech, almost a tirade, in which the Lord puts Job in his place. He says that it's all very well for Job to talk about God and his handling of the universe, but that's an area in which he has no direct knowledge. So if the Lord is going to parley with him, they must get this one thing straight, that this is an area in which the Lord knows what he's talking about, and Job doesn't. Would you now please settle down and read from the beginning of chapter 38 through to chapter 40, verse 2. So Job answered, "Ouch." What it actually says is in chapter 40, verses 3 to 5, if you'd look at those, please. The Lord then carries on. It should be mentioned here, of course, that the Lord has laid on some rather splendid audio-visual effects, by way of a thunderstorm. But read verses 6 to 14 in chapter 40. It's clear that the Lord hasn't yet finished putting Job in his place. And here he focuses rather more directly on the fact that Job has been posing questions and demanding answers from the Lord. The Lord says that his attitude amounts to putting the Lord in the dock in order to satisfy Job's own curiosity. There is in fact a whole section of theology known as theodicy, dealing, that is, with the righteousness of God, demonstrating that God is righteous. Job's focus, to be honest, has been on making sense of his own sufferings alongside the comfort of so many people of lesser virtue. And what the Lord is saying here is that his questioning also amounts to asking how a good and righteous God can run the world in such a way that things work out the way they do. So the Lord's response is, if you think you can engage in one-to-one verbal combat with me, then carry on. But it must be because you think you're my equal in the contest. So the rest of the chapter and chapter 41 are the Lord making it pretty clear that it would be absurd for Job to claim that he's capable of entering such a contest. It goes on so long, this particular speech from the Lord, that I think there's just the tiniest chance of his knocking the nail loose by going on for too long. We'll miss this section out, at any rate. We'll move straight to Job's reply. If you read the first 6 verses of chapter 42. So where does that get us? More particularly, where does it get Job in his quest for an answer to his questions? A careless reading might suggest that it doesn't get him anywhere, because the Lord never actually gives him an answer. Telling Job to shut up is a response to his questioning, but it isn't the sort of answer with an intellectual component that Job thought he was after. But then you realise that the Lord doesn't just tell Job to shut up. In effect, he says, shut up and worship me. Now that's a much bigger advance for Job to make. It returns Job to a living relationship with God, such as he'd had before Satan started messing about with him. He's come through the agonies of his suffering, and because he's had a genuine encounter with the Lord, his proper relationship with the Lord is restored. But what do we make of that? Asking questions about life and about our destiny is a very proper part of being a Christian. There's nothing wrong with it. In fact, it's healthy if you do it in a manner which matches your own intellectual and educational equipment. Some people have got a lot of that and can do a lot. Other people will need to be more modest in how they venture into this territory. But venturing into it is good. But the fact is that there are some questions to which we may not find any answers. The questions which stump us may be the same as Job's, or they may be different, but you should assume there will be such questions that stump us. So when one of those questions arises, what are you going to do about it? You might decide that in the face of an unanswerable question, there's no possibility of continuing in your Christian faith, you just give it all up. Or you might stomp and sulk and rail against the Lord because you want an answer and you can't find one. Or you might come to the conclusion, like Job eventually did, that it's more important to worship the Lord and, if necessary, leave your question with him unanswered. Clearly, the message of this extraordinary book is that you must be prepared to do that. You must be prepared to admit that you're not God, you're not his equal, you don't have his experience, his knowledge, or his understanding. So there can be issues which in an intellectual sense have beaten you, but which you will not allow to disrupt your relationship with the Lord. That concludes our work in the book of Job.